welcome to the stage today's host, Michael Casey.
Okay, this is quite a way to close out the day. Nice to see a nice big crowd of you all here. I don't think that our next guest needs any introduction, so I'm just going to say, please, joining me on stage, Robert F. Kennedy Jr.
Michael, pleasure to see you.
Take a seat, sir. Okay. So look, this is CoinDesk. We're a media company. We had some news today, so as a good journalist, I am going to just go straight at this with a question. For those who don't know, one of the candidates that Mr. Kennedy is running against was just convicted of 34 counts of a felony, and that is unprecedented in American political history. So we're really keen to know what that means for you and how you interpret that as a factor in this race.
Well, first of all, I'd say this was probably the weakest case of the cases that people have brought against him. And I think my belief is that it will end up helping President Trump among a large part of American public who believes that the judicial system and the enforcement system have been weaponized against politically. And that's bad for our country. And I think it's a mistake for the Democratic Party. I think the Democratic Party believes that it has a candidate that can't beat President Trump and that they need to do it in the court. And I think that's bad for our country. I think it's bad for democracy, and I think it's politically going to backfire on him. You know, I'm not a fan of President Trump's. I'm running against him. I'm running against him on the issues, on what he did, the debt. He ran up an $8 trillion debt, more than all of the presidents from George Washington to George W. Bush combined. He shut down our country after promising that he was going to run America like a business. He shut down all of our businesses, 3.3 million businesses with no due process, no just compensation, no scientific citation. He embroiled our country in foreign wars. He divided the division that we have in our country is now largely due to him and President Biden, and it's not a good thing for our country. And then, his positions on the environment, et cetera, have been bad to me for our country. But I think that's what the election should be about arguing about those issues, and not trying to eliminate people. I mean, the Democratic Party is trying to eliminate me by making it impossible for me to get on all the ballots. I don't think that's democratic. When I grew up in a Democratic Party, I was trying to get as many Americans as possible enfranchised, get them to vote, get them legally to vote, and now we have a Democratic Party that's trying to disenfranchise voters and to try to push candidates off with legal actions in the courtroom rather than the ballot box. And let's say they succeed in doing that. What kind of country are we left with? We're left with a country where half the people are deeply embittered and angry and feeling like they've been screwed. And I don't think that's good for our country.
This was a jury decision, right? This was a jury. This was not a judge. This was 34 counts. It was a very rapid decision. Do you yourself believe that the judicial system has been weaponized, or is your concern that there's a perception of this?
I think the federal agencies generally have been weaponized. I mean, I'm being denied the Secret Service protection. The Secret Service itself said that I'm at an enhanced risk. And they had plenty of evidence, including 4 break-ins to my house as the election occurred by people who are mentally ill, people who have come to my events wearing guns and fake federal ID, trying to set, and I don't want to make this about me, but we've seen very disturbing things. We saw 56 CIA agents who signed a letter to the American public saying that Hunter Biden's laptop was a Russian disinformation hoax, which they knew it was not, and that is one of the most obvious interferences with an election in this country's history by the intelligence agency, which by its charter is forbidden from doing that. I have litigation right now against President Trump that's in the Supreme Court, Kennedy versus Biden. The Twitter files, which Elon released, the other case that was brought, the companion case to my case, Murthy versus Biden, that was brought by the Missouri and Louisiana Attorney Generals, and the discovery in those cases show that 37 hours after he took the oath of office, President Biden opened up a portal, the White House opened up a portal, forced Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, YouTube, Google to open up portals by which the FBI, the CIA, CISA, the DHS, NIH, CDC, the IRS, and other agencies could go in and censor social media posts by Americans and remove Americans from their social media accounts, which they did to me. I had almost 1 million followers on Instagram, and they took it down at the orders of the White House. So yeah, I do think there is evidence that, when my father became Attorney General in 1961, the first week in office, he called together all the division heads, the bureau chiefs at the Department of Justice, and he said, rule number 1, this department will never be used for political purposes. We don't ask whether a defendant is a Democrat or Republican. We make no decisions based on politics because it's so important that the American public understand that the institutions of our government, the enforcement institutions, will never be used to promote one political candidate or one political party over another. And, President Biden has a bust of my father behind him at the Oval Office, which I'm grateful for. But the weaponization of our enforcement agencies is not a good thing. And I think we ought to be able to have public debates about issues rather than have this perception that we're like a third world country that has to get rid of political candidates that we don't like using the judicial system against them. And by the way, I don't mean to interrupt you, but I was a district attorney in that office. And, there's many years ago, this was 40 or 45 years ago, it's well known that district attorneys, I think it was Justice Brandeis said, a district attorney can convict a tomato if he wants to. District attorneys are making decisions because juries tend to go with what the district attorney recommends. So, just as to your point that this was a jury decision, yeah, it was, but the district attorney exercised his discretion to bring the case.
Okay, I know we don't want to dwell on Trump. We want to move on to a lot of the sort of issues that are pertinent to crypto here. But I'll just say one thing, and it does actually relate to the crypto perception. I mean, there is a view amongst many in this community that the one branch of government that has been sort of helpful to this industry is in fact the judicial branch. Is the judicial branch, because some of those cases that were brought against the SEC were successful. That there is at least this belief that we can trust in the courts, and that's a sense of relief for those who are concerned about the sort of federal agency overreach that you're talking about. So when you talk about this idea that in fact the judicial system is under threat in this sense, how do you square that?
Well, first, I agree with you that the judicial system still has more independence than any of the other federal agencies. But I think it's important that it be completely independent. There's a lot, I mean, particularly during COVID, I brought a lot of cases during COVID. My son, who's a new attorney and who's doing his first case right now, I had a discussion with him the other night that the law that you learn in law school, the black letter law, that judges often ignore that. So they have tremendous discretion to do things that are, the judges have one eye on the press and on the political system. And they're not supposed to, but they are. It's just a fact that they're sensitive about that. And I would say they're more sensitized right now than at any time, at least since the Gilded Age.
And just one last question on this. I mean, regardless of whether or not that you have these concerns are legitimate about this supposed weaponization, it's a convicted felon that's now running for office. Is that something that you support? I mean, how do we...
Do I support that? Well, the Constitution says there's only 3 requirements for running for president of the United States or for holding the office. One is that you're of age, that you're over 35. The other is that you're a United States citizen. The third is that you were born in this country. Technically, if you were in prison convicted of murder or some other heinous crime, you could still hold the office of President of the United States. So is that a good rule? I don't know, but that's the rule.
Fair enough. So that convicted felon came out a few days ago before this verdict and was made some very strong comments in favor of crypto. How do you beat that? What's your competing message with him and also, of course, with President Biden, specifically as it pertains to what now appears to be a rather energized voting bloc in this particular community?
I'm not sure what the question is.
I'm just saying, what's your message in the context of the fact that Trump has now come out and said he's pro-crypto and so forth? How do you win over this crowd? Yeah.
I'm delighted that he did that. I mean, I think listen, the more politicians, and Gary Gensler also came out, recently to do the ETF for Ethereum. And I think those are promising. Are they politically driven? Probably, but I'm not going to look into their motivations. I'm just happy they're doing it. I'm happy that President Trump announced at the Libertarian Convention that he was going to pardon Ross Ulrich, because I think the more people that recognize the importance of cryptocurrencies, Bitcoin, in particular, in my view, and the importance of having decentralized currencies that can reinvigorate our country, that can make our country once again a hub for innovation, for entrepreneurship, that can re-democratize our economy by making our economy more transparent, and giving individuals power to hold on to their wealth without dilution, power to transport the wealth across borders without the government confiscating it from you. All these, and also the importance in having some kind of root in a base currency that will keep us out of war. I mean, I would say in the last 100 years, there's probably only one war that the American people would have agreed to finance, and that would be World War II. All of these other wars would not have happened if we had base currency. They were all enabled by fiat currency, by the capacity of politicians to print money, because otherwise they'd have to come to us in advance and say, we want a war. This means you're going to have to give up your boarding schools for your kids. You're going to have to give up your boat. You're going to have to buy different kinds of food. You're going to have to downgrade your expectations for your economic expectations for the next 20 years to pay for it. And people would think about it, and they wouldn't do it. And the fact that politicians don't have to do that, they can just print money afterwards without asking anybody's permission, is the reason that we have wars and the reason that we're addicted to wars in this country. So all of the things that a decentralized base currency could do for our country in terms of allowing us to live up to our promise as a country, allowing us to operate efficiently, allowing people to hold on to their wealth that they've made with their hard work, with their minds and their energy. All of that, the more and more Americans who understand that that is the promise of Bitcoin and cryptocurrencies, the better it is. I'm really happy that President Trump is now on board, and that I'm happy with what Gary Gensler did. I think what he did is important. We need to go a lot further. We need to make sure that we can get capital flowing into cryptos in this country, and that we can keep America as the hub of cryptocurrencies and blockchain and AI and all these. In the last couple of years, there have been 1,200 new cryptocurrencies registered in Switzerland. The collective value of those companies is $360 billion. All of those are registered there because of the hostility of this administration, the war that they've mounted on cryptocurrencies. That innovation should be happening here in the United States of America. We have a $34 trillion debt. There's no way to cut our way out of that debt. The only way out of it is to grow our economy. And we're going to do that. In order to do that, you need a dramatic new industry, like the same way that we did with Silicon Valley back in the 90s and 2000s. We had a new industry, and that reinvigorated our nation and made our debt proportionally smaller. The only way that we're going to resolve the debt crisis is with a new industry, and the obvious industries for doing that are blockchain and AI, and we need to make sure not to drive them out of this country.
So you talk a lot about the freedom to transact, and you said, in fact, that it's, in your mind is important, perhaps even as the freedom of expression. And you just spoke eloquently about what that means, right? But what policy actions would you take as president to sort of support that? I mean, Bitcoin is legal. People can own Bitcoin. What would you change that would elevate the use of this technology for the purposes of that freedom?
Well, I think we need a clear regulatory framework, which we don't have. I think the FIT Act that Congress just passed is a good start to that because it distinguishes between centralized and decentralized currencies. And we need consumer protection. If somebody is involved in like the FTX or some kind of malicious pump and dump scam, we need to protect the consumer. My grandfather was the head of the FEC, the first head of the SEC, the Securities and Exchange Commission, and it was after Wall Street collapsed. And Wall Street collapsed as the public had lost faith in it because they realized that it was a casino that was being operated by the oligarchs. And my grandfather's job was to create rules and regulations for governing stocks that guaranteed transparency and that guaranteed that the little guy was able to transact without, being involved in some kind of con game. He succeeded in doing that and really saved Wall Street from itself. And I think we need to do the same thing right now with Bitcoin. We need to, it's a part of, cryptos are both commodities and they're securities, and they can change during their life cycle from one to the other. And I think it's important that they can be regulated in a way that we have a regulatory infrastructure that protects against fraud, protects against predatory practices, but also makes cryptocurrency is absolutely transactional, which you can't with Bitcoin. You can't. It's not really transactional now because you have to pay taxes on every purchase, right? If you go buy, an apple or a lunch, you have to pay taxes on that, and that's not a good outcome. We need them transactional the same way the currency is. And I don't think we're equipped now. The banking infrastructure in this country and the regulatory infrastructure is not equipped to regulate them in ways that are rational and that encourage their transactionality. I mean, we also need to guarantee self-custody. We may need to make them transactional. We need to make them transparent. And as I said, decentralized.
So you also talked about, if the US had a base currency, its impact on wars, the debt and so forth. What will be your position on the Federal Reserve? I mean, do you support its independence? And Jerome Powell will be up for nomination in 2026. If you were president, who would you nominate for that role, given the position that you hold towards the past practices with regard to monetary policy?
Yeah, I don't know. I don't know who I would nominate right now. But the fact you say, would I restore independence? Technically, the Fed is independent of the federal government, although it is highly politicized. But the real independence that it needs is independence from Wall Street and from the big banks, because that's who it's working for. And the whole cycle of quantitative easing is like a sump pump that the interaction between quantitative easing and then high interest rates is like a sump pump that is designed to suck money away from working people, from the American middle class, and funnel it upward. And these huge disparities that we have in wealth in our country are a direct result of that. The anger, the frustration that you see among Americans who can now no longer afford to eat or to buy homes is all the product of Fed policies that are designed to strip equity from the American people and turn us into a kind of feudal model or a colonial model. And what we need to do, I'm not going to say I'm going to abolish the Fed. I think the Fed was created for an important purpose, which it could still serve, which is to pump liquidity into solvent banks during economic crises, to try to ease economic crisis, and I think that's legitimate. It was also created, but for a lot of bad reasons, which have become the dominant reasons. And I think, generally speaking, what we need to do is to restore sovereignty over the Fed, which we don't have. That's now owned by Wall Street and the big banks and the BlackRock and State Street and Vanguard. And we need to restore transparency. One of the things that I would do is to shift power away from the Fed to the regional banks and to the discount windows. But I would remove the political function of the Fed and make it actually do what it was supposed to do, which is to avert crises when by putting liquidity into solvent institutions. I mean, what happened during 2008 was just this giant shift in equity from the American middle class upward, and what we have left of the American middle class was ruined by COVID, by the COVID lockdowns. And these are policies, I want to restore the American middle class, small businesses, economic independence, the American people, and the soundness of our money supply, and and ultimately reintegrate base currency into the process through a gradual process. My uncle tried to do that with the gold certificates and the silver certificates, which he issued right before he was killed. But I think we need to start thinking about mechanics for integrating at least into our deficit some kind of base currency discipline.
Okay, and what about the other federal agencies? You started out talking about weaponization of different regulatory agencies, and clearly this community has had a battle with the SEC. There's a lot of talk these days about executive overreach in that regard. What actual steps would you take to curtail that?
Well, each of the agencies is different, and I think what happens to most federal political presidential candidates, they promise to drain the swamp or to reform the agencies. And then they come in there and they're presented with an agency like NIH may have 30,000 employees, CIA has 20,000 employees. At every level of the bureaucracy, there are individuals who can commit a civil disobedience to embarrass the president, and they get intimidated. And so they bring in somebody from the regulated industry to run the agency. President Trump brought John Bolton in. After promising he was going to stay out of war, he brought John Bolton in to run the NSA, which is like putting the swamp creature in charge of the swamp. He put Scott Gottlieb, who was a business partner of Pfizer, in front of FDA. And Pfizer and Gottlieb did a $100 billion favor for his old company, for Pfizer, and then he left the FDA to go back on Pfizer's board and collect his payoff. He appointed Alex Azar to run the HHS, who was an Eli Lilly lobbyist. He put, coal lobbyists in charge of EPA and so on. Oh, I feel like I'm in a unique position to actually fix the agencies. I have litigated against almost all of them. I've sued EPA probably more than any attorney. I've sued CDC probably more than any attorney. I've sued NIH, EPA, FDA. I've sued the USDA many times. I'm involved with litigation right now against the Department of Agriculture on the Norfolk Southern spill, which is a symptom of regulatory capture. I sued the FCC a year ago and won that case in the Federal Court of Appeals for lying to the public about cell phone radiation, about the dangers of cell phone radiation. And when you sue these agencies, you get a PhD in corporate capture. You understand who the individuals are who are actually crooked and who have turned that agency into a sock puppet the industry is supposed to regulate. So I can tell you the names of individuals that I will move on day one from many of these agencies. And then you also get an understanding of the perverse incentives that put agency capture on steroids. I'll give you just a couple of examples. FDA gets 50% of its budget from pharmaceutical companies. Well, that's insane. It's working for the pharmaceutical companies. We passed a law called the Bayh-Dole Act in 1980 that allowed scientists and officials who work for NIH to collect royalties on any product that they regulate. So I'll give you an example. The Moderna vaccine, which was developed by NIH, is 50% owned by NIH. There are 6 individuals at NIH who were Anthony-Fauci's closest deputies who each have march-in rights for the patent, and they are collecting $150,000 a year forever, as long as mRNA vaccines or products are on the market. So you have the individuals at the highest level of the agency who are paying for their mortgages, their kids' education, their boats, their alimonies, and all their other expenses, as long as those drugs are being sold. These are the people whose job it is to find problems with that drug. And yet they're incentivized to overlook those problems and indeed to pass rules that say you can't go to work unless you take this product. You can't get on an airplane unless you take this product. And you're going to lock down until everybody gets a jab, gets this jab. It's a very, very perverse incentive, and I'm going to end those payoffs of that incentive system.
So when I hear that, I hear something that I think that resonates with a lot of people across actually both parties, right? This idea of the perverse incentives, the corporate capture of our agencies, and in this particular case, the health agencies. You're now there, and you're trying to win this race. You've got your own former Democratic Party that you need to pull from, and you've got Republicans, obviously. Where people will read your comments about vaccines is often less about that aspect of it, the capture and the motives and the incentives, and some of the things you've said about vaccines and its impact and its on human beings and the risks associated with that, which I think personally are two very different things. Like, how do you square that, and do you worry that that message will hinder your ability to reach the Democratic base in particular?
I think my position on vaccines have always been that I'm not anti-vaccine. I've said that for 20 years. The term anti-vax applied to me as a pejorative to discredit me, to silence me, to make people not listen because, oh, he's anti-vax and therefore he must be crazy. But I've always said for 20 years, I'm not anti-vaccine. I got fully vaccinated. I didn't do the COVID vaccine, but prior to that, I was fully vaccinated. I took the flu vaccine every year. My 7 kids are all fully vaccinated. So I'm not, my issue has always been two things. One is I want good science. I want to get the pharmaceutical industry out of the regulatory process, and I want to have good science, so that we have a very good information, the best information possible on efficacy issues. Does the vaccine actually work on the target disease? And secondly, safety issue. Are you more likely 7 years from now, after taking this product, to be alive and healthier than if you did not? Those questions we have for every medical product except vaccines. Why is that? Because vaccine is the only medical product or drug or medical device that is exempt from pre-licensing safety studies. So I actually litigated on this issue, sued the HHS and said, because for many years I was saying there has never been a safety study on any of the 72 vaccines that are required for our children. When I was a kid, I got 3 vaccines. I was fully compliant. My kids had to take 72 vaccines, and now today's kids have to take upwards of 80 before they're 18 in order to stay in school in states like California and New York. And my question was, have any of those vaccines ever been subject to pre-licensing placebo-controlled trials? And the fact is they're all exempt, and not one of them has ever had a pre-licensing safety trial. What that means is that nobody knows what the real risk profile is for that product. And I think before we ask Americans, particularly healthy Americans, these are not people who are sick, they're people who are perfectly healthy, before they take a medical intervention, there should be good safety science on it. Their doctors should know it, they should know it. And the other issue is that people do get injured by these products. In fact, as you probably know, vaccines are exempt from any litigation. So no matter how reckless the company is, no matter how negligent they are in creating that product, no matter how grievous your injury, you cannot sue that company. And this act was passed in 1986, and at that time, there were only a few vaccines, but that caused a gold rush, where all these other products were added to the schedule, because now you have a product that one of the biggest costs for every medical product is downstream liability, and now that was erased. With vaccines, there's also no advertising requirements, because the government is ordering 76 million kids to take the product, and there are no safety study requirements, which saves them about $250 million. So it's like, it's the ideal product, and the government pays for a lot of its development. And so, you know, it's a product that we need to really watch carefully, because the industry has no incentive to make it safe on its own. And this is an industry, there's 4 companies that make all of them for our country. And those 4 companies have paid about $75 billion in criminal penalties for their other products over the past decade and a half. So those are products they can get sued on. And they paid $79 billion in criminal penalties. But here's a product you can never sue them on. They can never get caught. And so do we have any assurance that they're treating this product any better than they did with Vioxx and all the other drugs? And, you know, there are millions of Americans, the vaccine court has paid out billions of dollars to people who are injured. In the preamble of the Vaccine Act says, vaccines are unavoidably unsafe. Some people are going to get injured, some are going to die. And that's why we need to give this immunity from liability. And it created a vaccine court. Well, that court has paid out billions of dollars to people who are injured. So people do get injured, people do die. And what I want to do is to make sure that we're studying those people, we're taking care of them, and we're making sure that we make that product as safely as possible. I've never said I'm going to take vaccines away from people. I believe in freedom of choice. If you want that product, you ought to be able to get it. I say one other thing. Right now, the CDC has recommended recently the 9th COVID booster. So they're telling Americans this is necessary for your health to get 9. Fewer than 10% of Americans are doing that. That means 90% of Americans have lost faith in those recommendations. Do you think it's advisable that the CDC can now order you to not go to your job, to not leave your home, to not get on an airplane, to not go into a public building unless you get that 9th booster? I don't think most Americans don't want that. And I believe we should have freedom of choice in every part of our lives. And if you want to take it, you can.
So we could, talk for ages about this, because there's a very strong argument on the other side that in fact the sort of widespread access to those vaccines was a major factor in reducing the incidence of injury and death within the society. But let's move to.
I would dispute that.
Okay.
I don't think there's much science on that.
So. But again, I'll come at this from the political angle, and it's not just. Let's move on from vaccines. You have a Democratic base that you need to draw from to win. You also have Republicans. How do you win them over? And also the perception that you may actually lose and therefore be a spoiler to those needs, and that you'll invite in a person that on the Democratic side would see as a threat to democracy.
Well, first of all, I would say this. Right now, we do extensive polling. About 57% of my supporters, if I'm not in the race, will vote for President Trump. So if I leave the race, from our own individual polling, that would benefit President Trump. We recently, Zogby, which one of the biggest poll houses in America, recently did the biggest poll of this election. A typical poll by Quinnipiac or Harvard-Harris, New York Times, Siena, has about 600 to 2,200 people that they survey. The Zogby poll polled 26,000, so more than 10 times the biggest poll. In all 50 states, the margin of error is almost zero. Anybody who does this poll will get the same results. That poll showed a couple of interesting things. One is, in a 3-way race right now, President Biden wins if I'm in the race. President Trump wins if I'm in the race. if I get out of the race, President Trump wins, but he wins but 2 extra states. He wins Maine and he wins Virginia. So me leaving the race benefits President Trump. Number 2, in a head-to-head race, I beat President Biden, between me and President Biden, I beat President Biden 39 states to 11. In a head-to-head race, me against President Trump, I beat President Trump. Only by a much smaller amount, by only about 3 electoral college votes. So it's a nail biter, but I still win. There's no condition in which President Biden can win. And what I've said to President Biden, what I've said to President Biden, I did the no spoiler challenge, issued it, and I said, let's you and I do a poll in October of you against President Trump and me against President Trump. We'll joint finance the poll, big group of people, and whoever does worse against President Trump will drop out of the race. And I'm happy to do that if he takes that deal. So
can you win a 3-way race is the big question here.
Well, at this point,
how do you get there?
At this point, I would lose the numbers. How do you get race. But I have 5 months and 5 days, and I'm beating President Trump and President Biden among people under 35 years. I mean, all Americans under 35. I'm beating them in independents, which is the largest political party. This year is the first year independents are bigger than Republicans or Democrats. In fact, independents are 43% of the electorate, and Republicans are 27%. Democrats are 27%. Oh, the biggest cohort, I beat them. And I beat them in a lot of other cohorts. The one group that I don't do well in is with baby boomers. And you would think I would do really well with them because that's my age group, and they all remember Camelot, and they were here during the Kennedy era, and they have, a lot of them are very nostalgic about it, but also I was a big champion under this group when I was known only as an environmental hero. And, but I do poorly on them, and here's why I think I do poorly. The same reason, the converse reason why I do well with young people. They're getting their news from MSNBC, CNN, the TV networks, the New York Times, the Washington Post.
I would say a bunch of them are getting it from Fox News as well, to be clear, but that generation, yes.
Well, yeah, but the Fox News, and I think that's why I do well with Trump people, because Fox News lets me on.
Okay.
but those, and that's why I do well, with Trump followers. I think the group that I don't do well with is a group that never sees me, because they will not let me do a live interview on any of those networks. But they're starting to now. I did one with Ari Melbourne on MSNBC recently. It was semi-live. It was, it was a full interview though. And I did, and then I've done one with Aaron Burnett on CNN. These are the only ones. And what we find is that when people see me talk and they realize I'm not the person that I've been characterized in the press, that we have a very high conversion rate. If kids tell us all the time, I got my parents to listen to a Joe Rogan podcast, and they're now Kennedy supporters. And so, our challenge is doing that. I have a higher popularity rating, much, much higher, like 10 or 20 points ahead of President Trump and President Biden in all the polls. Oh, people want to vote for me, and if people were voting just based upon hope or inspiration, I would win. But they're voting out of fear. Democrats are voting for President Biden because they believe if they vote for me, it's going to throw the vote away and it will be the end of the republic. And Republicans feel the same way about President Trump. And so my job really over the next 5 months is to convince Americans to vote out of hope rather than vote out of fear. 80% of Americans say they don't want to have to choose between President Trump and President Biden. And
so, Mr. Kennedy, we're running very low on time, but just a question, it's like a double question I want to just throw at you, we'll go run a little over here, because I'd really like to get your sense of it. It sounds when I hear from you as if you're as much running against the two-party system as you are running against these two people. So from the perspective of this community who, are really building in many respects a new system of power, how do you see your role in that regard? And can you also frame that in the terms of the legacy of your name? Because, some members of your family have been critical of you, but there is, I imagine there's a tradition that you feel like you're drawing upon here as you take on these battles.
Yeah, I mean, I think the connection between what this community wants for our country and what I want is the reason I was drawn to this community in the first place is the exact same thing, which is a redemocratization of American society. Have transparency, have integrity, have freedom, to have a resistance, mechanisms, particularly with the rise of AI and all of these really dystopian, totalitarian technologies that can be used, one, to harvest our data, but also for surveillance and control by the government. We need something to protect us now, to protect our values, our democracy, our transparency, all of these, our freedoms. And the obvious way to do that is through blockchain. And blockchain, you can fix the election system. Oh, I got introduced to this because during COVID, we were embedded with the truck strikers in Canada, and we rode with them all the way from Alberta all the way to Ottawa, and so when they got to Ottawa, it was a very peaceful demonstration. It was like Woodstock. They're every color of the rainbow, the Asian and African and white. And when they got to Ottawa, they were, cleaning up the streets. They were providing drinking water. They were taking out the trash. There was music on the street. It was really like Woodstock. And yet, the Trudeau government decided that it was going to refuse to meet with them. All they wanted to do was to exercise a right that everybody in this country takes for advantage, was the right of assembly and the right to petition their representatives and to talk with them. And Justin Trudeau said, I'm not going to meet with you. You're dangerous to the Republic. And they hadn't broken any laws. So they used AI systems and they used other forms of surveillance to identify the truckers, their license plates, their photographs, facial recognition, all this. And then they shut down their bank accounts. They never were charged with a crime. They certainly weren't convicted. But all of a sudden, they couldn't buy fuel. They couldn't buy diesel for their trucks. They couldn't move their trucks. They couldn't pay for their kids' food. They couldn't pay. One trucker said to me that he was going to jail because he couldn't pay his alimony check. And it occurred to me then, when I saw this happening, and I know this happens in China, with their CBDCs CBDCs in China that have the power to, when somebody falls low on the social credit rating, to make it so your credit card which is your face, will only work in grocery stores within walking distance of your house. And they can punish you that way, so you can't buy gas and stuff. And I knew it was happening in China, but I saw it happening in Canada. And I saw it happening here with PayPal, fining people $2,500, stealing their money if they promoted misinformation, which is not factually erroneous statements, but simply assertions that challenge government orthodoxies. And I was shocked, and I understood that time that transactional freedom is as important as freedom of expression. Because if you have a government that can shut down your bank account when you criticize a politician or criticize a current a policy, that government has a license for any atrocity, because you can silence 99.99% of people if they know you're going to shut off the heat in your home, your bank account, all of these things. If you say the wrong thing, That is, at that point I said, the framers would have put this in the First Amendment before freedom of speech if anybody ever suspected that a system would rise up that gave the government the power to surveil and stop every transaction. That is a power the framers never imagined. And they would have given us a right, but they didn't know that this would ever happen. To me, is as important as the First Amendment, and the only path out of all of these, terrible crises we're in, including the debt crisis and the crisis of the rising totalitarian systems. The only path out, the most obvious path out, is blockchain, and that's why I support.
Okay. Well, on that note, a thank you to Robert F. Kennedy for joining us here in the Consensus. Okay. All right, well, that's all we have for today. Thank you for sticking around for a slightly later session here. Another day tomorrow. Please join us for more at Consensus. Enjoy your evenings. Bye-bye.